The lands will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on restoring multiple use to revitalize America's public lands and rural communities. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to participate in today's hearing from the dais. The gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crank. Without objection, so ordered. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3, Parent O. Without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. I want to welcome everybody to the first official subcommittee on federal lands in the 119th Congress. Last Congress, the subcommittee continued its bipartisan tradition by sending more than 15 separate pieces of legislation to the president's desk. In fact, if federal lands were counted as a full committee, it would have tied for the fourth most productive committee in the House last Congress. This is also based on a conservative estimate, since we're not counting the numerous other bills signed into law through comprehensive packages like the Explore Act. As we begin our important work in this new Congress, this subcommittee will work with the Trump administration and the new Republican Senate majority to restore multiple use to our public lands, empower local communities, and revitalize rural economies. And there's much work to be done. President Biden left America's public lands and natural resources in a sorry state. For 4 long years, President Biden and his federal land managers abandoned the long-standing and previously uncontroversial principle of multiple use. Instead, they adopted top-down preservationist schemes designed to placate extreme environmentalists. Along the way, Biden's officials never seemed to notice or care that their reckless policies were inflicting enormous damage on America's rural economy, housing affordability, energy dominance, and national security. While virtually no American was spared by President Biden's irresponsible natural resource policies, the harm was felt most acutely out west. Growing urban centers like Salt Lake City and Las Vegas suffer from exorbitant housing and rental prices, largely because they are encircled by federal land. Rural communities are facing economic devastation as generations-old grazing and logging businesses have had to shut down due to ruinous regulations. And on top of all that, the Democrats' profligate spending brought us the highest inflation in 40 years, which disproportionately hurt rural residents. The startling scope and arrogance of these policies were laid bare by the Biden administration's 30 by 30 agenda. Under this initiative, federal land managers sought to lock up at least 30% of the nation's land and waters by 2030. Seldom remarked was the fact that the federal government already owns 640 million acres, or roughly 28% of the nation's land mass, including nearly 50% of the land out west. The 30 by 30 initiative then was simply a misleading attempt to justify further land grabs. 30 by 30 was consistently cited when the Biden administration designated new national monuments or announced ill-advised mineral withdrawals. Under glaring abuses of the Antiquities Act, the former president sealed off nearly 6 million acres in California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. Adding insult to injury, the federal land managers who planned and implemented these national monuments often displayed sneering disregard for local opinion. Again and again, local officials and residents reported that their questions and concerns had been deflected or ignored. This was also true of the BLM's public lands rule, which overturned the long-standing statutory precedent of multiple use and sustained yield. The rule empowers environmental groups and foreign entities to purchase so-called conservation leases and thereby lock up millions of acres of public lands intended for multiple use. Despite repeated requests to hold more in-person listening sessions from members across this dais in Western states, the Biden administration refused to do so and pushed this rule forward over the objections of governors, local officials, ranchers, recreationalists, and countless others. Similar issues plagued the resource management plans issued by Biden's bureaucrats. In Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, the BLM used resource management plans to prohibit energy production, limit economic activity, and block traditional access. And yet again, federal land managers simply dismissed local outrage. These examples lead to an inescapable conclusion. When bureaucrats in Washington turn their backs on multiple use, they also turn their backs on the American people. Thankfully, a unified Republican government means that relief is now at hand. Instead of ignoring local voices, we are putting Western communities back in the driver's seat to shape the land and resource policies that affect their lives. Further, committee Republicans will ensure that federal land managers understand that under our watch, coordination will always require attentive, good faith, and meaningful engagement with local communities. The days of ignoring and downplaying stakeholders' concerns are over. I could go on forever about these issues, but fortunately we have some high-caliber witnesses in front of us who are eager to share their expertise. So, in closing, I'd like to thank all of them for traveling here today. Please know that your insights are highly valued by each member of this subcommittee. With that, I yield and recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pinch hitting for our subcommittee ranker for now. I appreciate it. This subcommittee will host some very important conversations in the coming months, conversations and debates over policy that will have profound impacts on the future of our public lands. And it is clear from the onslaught of attacks emanating from the White House that the heart and soul of America's public lands is at stake here. Between Project 2025 and its extreme targeting of public lands, and now the aggressive rollout of the Project 2025 agenda through executive orders, hiring freeze, funding freeze, there's no question that federal land management agencies, along with many other federal agencies, are under siege. This reckless and illegal action is delaying the delivery of critical funds to state, local, and tribal partners right now. It is paralyzing the implementation of wildfire mitigation projects that keep communities safe. It is pausing or outright canceling the hiring process for critical personnel with vital functions like public safety, resource protection, and others. Shockingly, constituents in my district who are hard at work implementing post-fire disaster recovery and wildfire mitigation projects have been forced to pause these efforts without any idea how long this pause will even remain in effect. They could lose an entire season because of the administration's actions. There's nothing woke about reducing wildfire risk and helping communities rebuild. These efforts are essential for public safety, regardless of politics, so this is beyond perplexing. On top of that, countless federal employees have no idea if they still even have a job because these tech bros, along with Elon Musk, these unelected, unaccountable private sector actors are rifling through all of their computer systems and private information, in some cases suggesting mass layoffs. And doing that with nonpartisan civil servants is incredibly short-sighted. This ego-driven vendetta is going to have grave consequences. And those who support it or those who simply stand by while it happens will own those consequences. The tech bros at DOGE have no idea how much Americans love their public lands. Visitation is skyrocketing. Outdoor recreation is booming. And thanks to the hard work and dedication of the Biden administration, conservation is on the rise. Democrats are proud of the progress we achieved in the last 4 years, but unfortunately, the country's about to experience a massive sense of whiplash. Newly confirmed Interior Secretary Burgum has wasted no time in rolling out the Project 2025 playbook. His secretarial orders set the stage for rolling back practically every beneficial public lands policy from the past 4 years, exactly as called for in Project 2025. Rolling back initiatives like the Public Lands Rule, stripping protections for places like the Boundary Waters, peeling back national monuments to hand over our public lands to polluting billionaire barons is a betrayal of the American people and the lands we all love. This plan, again, is right out of Project 2025, and Donald Trump swore up and down that it was not his plan. Many of you here denied it as well, but here we are with an administration that is following it to the letter. My Republican colleagues insist that they support policies that reflect their commitment and the input of rural communities. Well, let me tell you, there are going to be a lot of incensed rural stakeholders when the president carries through with his plans to roll back all of these protections. We have an obligation and a responsibility to manage our public lands in a balanced way that keeps future generations in mind and puts conservation on equal footing with other demands and uses. To put it in context of this hearing today, balance is a key component of multiple use. My district is full of rural communities, and I can assure you that the local input that Republicans repeatedly cite isn't just a blanket request for more development and extraction and pollution. Local input includes requests from tribes seeking to protect sacred sites and cultural resources from destruction by foreign mining conglomerates, or local communities hoping to preserve the unspoiled landscapes around them. That's why Democrats work with their communities to develop legislative solutions for public lands in their districts. Democrats also represent rural communities surrounded by public land, just like many of you. All you have to do is to look at the members of this subcommittee and the districts they represent. Unfortunately, our efforts are often blocked in Congress by our colleagues across the aisle. But first and foremost, we need to put an end to the uncertainty and the chaos that's going on right now because of President Trump's federal funding freeze. I really hope my colleagues across the aisle will start engaging on that, paying attention to the damage that is rolling out to all of our districts. If we really want to help rural communities, that is a good place to start. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you for the opening statement, Mr. Huffman. And we're going to move on to witness testimony here. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, press the on button. On the microphone, we use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. First, I would like to introduce the Honorable Eric Clark, the County Attorney of Washington County, Utah. Mr. Clark, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and members of the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to address you today. My ancestors settled the area of Bryce Canyon National Park and the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. I was in high school in 1996 when the 1.7 million acre monument was created, and my town became surrounded by public lands that were no longer managed for multiple use. Professionally, I have worked in the Washington County Attorney's Office in Southwest Utah for 14 years and have served as the elected county attorney since 2020. I regularly work on public land issues involving federally protected plants and animals, land exchanges with the BLM, highway and water development projects, resource and travel management plans, and visitor crowding in Zion National Park. For better or worse, I am an expert when it comes to the often dysfunctional public land bureaucracy. My family has lived in southern Utah for 6 generations. My grandpa Clark worked in the Escalante sawmill, which relied on timber harvested from Forest Service land. He also ran cattle on BLM-managed lands that are now part of the Grand Staircase National Monument. His livelihood relied on positive and functional partnerships with federal land management agencies, and he lived a long, happy life. Unfortunately, the sawmill is now closed because the Forest Service could not provide consistent timber permits. Running cattle becomes more and more difficult due to constantly changing federal land management and restrictions. I have 6 siblings, but only 1 lives in our home county. There are simply not enough high-paying jobs to keep people in the area. I live in nearby Washington County, which, in contrast to my home county, is thriving economically. Our population center is 90 miles from Las Vegas on Interstate 15, and we are the gateway to Zion National Park, which had over 5 million visitors last year. We have experienced rapid population growth for decades, growing from 10,000 residents 65 years ago to more than 200,000 today. Like other population centers in the Southwest, conserving water and improving our water infrastructure are of paramount importance to us. An egregious example of a broken bureaucratic system is the BLM administrative land exchange process. We must improve our water reuse capacity, and the first step in our comprehensive water reuse plan was to complete a non-controversial land exchange where the county would acquire a reuse reservoir site and BLM would receive designated critical habitat that would increase the size of the Red Cliffs National Conservation Area. The BLM estimated it could complete the simple exchange in 18 months. but it has been 8 years, and the exchange is still in process. We cannot meet our water needs if every step in the federal process takes a decade to complete. We also have to build new arterial roads to meet our growth demands. Congress approved a northern corridor for our community in the 2009 Omnibus Public Lands Management Act. In that same bill, and with our county support, Congress designated 250,000 acres of wilderness, 110,000 acres of national conservation area lands, and 165 miles of wild and scenic river. In 2021, the BLM approved a 4.5-mile northern corridor. Simultaneously, we protected thousands of acres of Mojave Desert tortoise habitat. But 2 months ago, the BLM revoked that right-of-way, removed the protections on the habitat, and flaunted the clear direction from Congress to delineate a buildable road corridor by 2012. I've worked on this project for 10 years, and it is beyond frustrating to have our good faith, growth, and conservation efforts disregarded. Communities surrounded by federal lands need reliable and responsive federal partners. For communities to thrive, we need consistent multiple-use management. Congressional action on permitting reform, including judicial review, will be helpful. Maximizing public uses on federal lands also depends on congressional oversight of how federal land management agencies' handbooks and internal policies are utilized to thwart or delay multiple uses on those lands. We need consistency in land management decisions. We need those decisions to be completed in a timely, cost-effective manner, and we need the BLM to follow its multiple-use mandate. Work with us to preserve our cherished public lands, encourage responsible access, and provide for economic growth. My great-great-great-grandparents helped settle southern Utah. I hope that my generation is not the last in my family to have the opportunity to live in our amazing area. Thank you for holding this important hearing today.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Clark. I'll now recognize Mr. Tim Canterbury, President of the Public Lands Council. Mr. Canterbury, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to provide testimony today. My name is Tim Canterbury, and I serve as president of the Public Lands Council. Since 1968, PLC has been the only organization in Washington, D.C. dedicated to representing the unique perspectives of cattle and sheep producers who hold the 22,000 federal grazing permits across the West. Between the Forest Service and the BLM, approximately 250 million acres have grazing as an authorized use in any given year. For 5 generations, my family has raised cattle in Colorado. Aside from my private land, I've held BLM and Forest Service grazing permits since the 1980s and managed the lands, waters, wildlife, and multiple uses they sustain. Like other grazing permittees, I am responsible for maintaining fences, water troughs, pipelines, culverts, and other infrastructure on my allotment that benefits my livestock and other users of these lands. These other users are plentiful. Colorado is home to some of the country's most popular hiking and climbing areas. 2 of the most used trails to access these 14ers run through my allotments. In the height of summer, we have measured more than 1,000 people per day who go through my grazing allotment on these trails. I have adjusted my grazing rotations and embraced emerging technologies to reduce the potential for conflict between recreationalists and my livestock, like gates left open, damage to water tanks, and soil disturbance from heavy foot traffic. This is all part of normal multiple-use management for ranchers like me. Western economies depend on successful multiple use, and grazing is a tool that makes true multiple use possible. Grazing reduces wildfire risk by more than 40%. Without grazing, hikers, bikers, hunters, and climbers would all lose out to damage from catastrophic wildfire or other land loss. Public lands are crucial to the domestic agriculture supply chain, too. Approximately 63% of the Western cattle herd and more than 50% of the national sheep herd spend time grazing on public lands. These livestock operations directly support trucking companies, feed mills, fencing companies, water management systems, veterinarians, and more. Loss of these lands would cripple regional and national livestock production. Research from the University of Wyoming shows that if grazing were removed from just 3 states, Idaho, Oregon, and Wyoming, you would see a 60% decrease in cattle sales in those states and over 40,000 jobs eliminated in a 10-year period. Apply that formula to all Western states and the impact of grazing management is clear. The challenges in our operations are plentiful. Besides economic drivers and unpredictable Mother Nature, there are activist groups who work to exploit rules and lawsuits to eliminate public lands grazing. We survive because the facts about our good management and the law are on our side. But sometimes the law places huge regulatory burdens on me and my family. We bear the burdens of implementing the ESA, NEPA, Antiquities Act, and more. The biggest challenge is when our federal regulations work against us rather than with us. Over the last several years, we saw an administration that doubled down on harmful rules, including the BLM Public Lands Rule. More land designations and a reduced focus on active management is not the solution. I offer the following suggestions for Congress to help ensure decisions are made on the ground rather than in an office in Washington. Number 1, direct agencies to increase the use of targeted grazing to reduce wildfire risk. We thank Representative LaMalfa and this committee for leadership on this issue. 2, direct specific resources to ensure agencies can do NEPA and permitting in a timely way. This will decrease the risk of litigation and improve efficiency. 3, reform statutes like the ESA and the Antiquities Act that have repeatedly been abused to the detriment of the landscape. More land designations are not the solution. And finally, set expectations that all kinds of energy development avoid or minimize impacts to livestock grazing. Everyone should have to play by the same rules so that no one use is more important than another. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on the role grazing plays in making multiple use possible. We are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Canterbury. I now recognize Mr. Dan Gibbs, Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Mr. Gibbs, welcome. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany. Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Goose, and the esteemed members of the subcommittee. I'm really excited to be here today. As the Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, I'm proud to share the incredible work we do to meet our mission to develop, preserve, and enhance Colorado's natural resources. I've led the Colorado DNR since 2019, but my love for the natural resources began while living in Gunnison County, Colorado, with the Gunnison River right in my backyard and public lands right there as well. My parents are both public school educators, and their experience as teachers influenced me to pursue a career in public service. Over my career, I've worked for Congressman Mark Udall, was a state representative, state senator, and a county commissioner. I've also fought fires throughout the West as a certified wildland firefighter. I live in Summit County, which is a community comprised of over 80% federal lands. We cherish our public lands in Colorado. They provide a vital public good that improves the mental health and physical well-being of our residents and visitors while also generating tremendous economic opportunities. Colorado is an all-above energy state. We've worked hard to find the balance for the energy transition with the need for reliable energy. For instance, we are the 4th largest oil and gas producing state with vast natural gas reserves, coal, hard rock minerals, geothermal sources, and seemingly endless sunshine and consistent winds that assist our efforts to increase renewable energy generation. In addition to enabling resource extraction, our public lands support our growing outdoor recreation economy. We are privileged to live in a state that contains 22 million acres of public lands. Colorado's expansive prairies, mountain river valleys, desert canyons are essential to our lifestyle, heritage, and identity. Colorado's outdoor recreation industry contributes $36.5 billion in GDP and represents 12% of our state's entire labor force. To manage this, we've developed a robust partnership between local, state, federal, and tribal entities through our Colorado Outdoor Strategy and regional partnership initiatives. Through this proactive approach, our dedicated staff work closely with our federal partners to responsibly manage and enhance outdoor recreation. In Colorado, we proudly work hand in hand with our federal partners as evidenced and our successful co-management of the Arkansas Headwaters Recreation Area since 1989. The BLM and the U.S. Forest Service own much of the area along 152 miles of the Arkansas River, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife collects a user fee to help manage the boat launch, campgrounds, and river rescue, among other activities. The co-management effort has been so successful that we're now exploring replicating this in other areas around the state, in particular the Pikes Peak region in Colorado Springs. As a wildland firefighter and resident of a fire-prone community, I've seen firsthand the risks that megafires pose. Because wildfires don't know the difference between federal, state, and private and tribal lands, we need a management strategy that reflects an all-lands approach. We're very proud of our shared stewardship agreement with the U.S. Forest Service, and we hope to soon finalize a similar agreement with the BLM. The shared stewardship agreement that was initiated under the first Trump administration provide the structure to combine funding towards doing the right work at the right place and the right scale based on collaborative input. Colorado and much is the arid West is one lightning strike, one unattended campfire away from the next devastating megafire. By prioritizing, planning, and working together, we can take advantage of shared federal-state resources to create the economies of scale needed to treat the acres to protect lives, property, and critical infrastructure. Shared stewardship should not be limited solely based on forest management, but instead should apply this important tool broadly to collaboratively manage trails, water, wildlife, and much more. As a former county commissioner, I know our rural communities and understand the challenges they face. We must manage and fund our lands in a way that allows for these communities to reap the benefits. In Colorado, our extensive network of stakeholder networking collaborative groups work hard to get projects off the ground. The funding that Colorado receives from the federal government is imperative to accomplish projects that cover everything from flood mitigation to dam and mine safety, typically in rural communities. Recent efforts to freeze federal funds are creating significant uncertainty and concern among our constituents and are already negatively impacting these types of projects. Federal funding is the bedrock of these programs. I encourage you to continue to partner with states. Together, we can leverage our natural resource funding to obtain extraordinary, efficient, and cost-effective life-saving outcomes. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I now recognize Mr. Jim Neiman, President and CEO of Neiman Enterprises. Welcome, Mr. Neiman, and you have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also like to recognize Congresswoman Hageman, apparently had to leave, but also want to thank the rest of the committee. My name is Jim Neiman, President of Neiman Enterprises, a multi-generational sawmill business operating in South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, and Oregon. I appreciate the opportunity and feel very blessed to be here today to testify. For 89 years, our family business has been built on perseverance, adaptability, and a deep commitment to forestry and our communities. My grandfather founded our first mill in 1936 in the Black Hills. Our work is about more than timber. It's about sustaining forest and communities. A critical partnership exists between the Forest Service and the forest products companies. The Forest Service relies on industry to manage 193 million acres of federal lands, while we rely on the agency for a stable supply of raw material. When this partnership functions well, it creates stability for business and enables the Forest Service to implement much needed treatments on the landscape. However, for this partnership to succeed, all parties must be fully committed. In the Black Hills, where my company has deep roots, the Forest Service has a long history of sustainable timber management dating back to the very first federal timber sale in 1899. Proper forest management has proven to control insect infestation, reduce wildfire risk, and ensure a sustainable supply of timber. However, we now experiencing a 75% reduction, I repeat, 75% reduction in the timber sale program in the Black Hills. This year, the Forest Service has proposed a timber sale program that meets only a fraction of what one of our mills in Spearfish needs to stay operating, let alone the needs of the broader forest industry in the area. Unfortunately, we're seeing a decline in forest management, not only in the Black Hills, but across multiple forests through the Forest Service regions. The consequences are real and permanent. In 1921, despite record high lumber prices, we were forced to close a mill in South Dakota due to inadequate Forest Service timber sales. Today, our 2 remaining sawmills in the Black Hills are running at 50% capacity and incurring tremendous financial losses, while other companies are being forced to truck material across 3 states to fill their needs and fill the gap. The need to do more in our forest isn't new and is supported by both parties. Yet in the last 4 years, timber output has dropped 17% nationwide, and multiple sawmills have heavily relied on federal lands have now shut down. The loss of sawmills means more than economic hardship. It devastates communities. 2 of our 4 operations, Wyoming and Oregon, reside in very small communities where our family business is the economic backbone. Without it, both could become another ghost town, losing its schools, healthcare, and local businesses. Our industry is highly capital intensive. Building a modern sawmill today costs well over $200 million. No business would make that kind of investment to manage federal lands when existing mills are struggling to access supplies of raw materials. We know what works, but we need to act immediately. Many federal legislative policies fail to support the federal management levels needed to reduce wildfire and insects risk. The Forest Service needs clear priorities, and we must fully utilize the capacity we already have before exploring new markets or industries. The Organic Act of 1897 established our national forest with a clear mission to manage them to ensure a permanent wood supply and clean water and prevent destruction of insects and fire. Today, we are failing to meet those objectives. Reduced management is harming forest, watersheds, wildlife, and communities. These problems are fixable, but we must act fast. So to save the forest, communities, and the industry that we depend on, we have a very serious situation here, and I just want to thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman, and God bless America.
Thank you, Mr. Neiman. Now we'll take members' questions. Members, you will have 5 minutes for your questioning. We will start out with the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to the ranking member and the Democratic witness talk about the need for more money, I'm struck by the fact that throughout the 20th century, we not only maintained healthy and fire-resilient forests, we made money doing it. Federal timber auctions, federal grazing contracts actually generated an enormous flow of capital. 25% of that funding went to local governments that were impacted by the federal lands to compensate them for land that's off their tax rolls. And the other 75% went into our land management agencies, right back into good land management. Mr. Neiman, what happened?
You can reflect back into the 70s and 80s and watch what we went through, but when I look at what happened in the 90s and the reduction of the Forest Service cutting the volume considerably back, and we lost a lot of sawmills through that time period.
Yeah, we saw that in the Sierra Nevada. We saw a 75% reduction in timber harvested off the federal lands, and we saw a concomitant increase in acreage destroyed by catastrophic fire in the same period. We saw the number of sawmills operating in California go from about, I think it was 180, down to about 30. And we have now entered an era of catastrophic fire. Now, there's nothing new in that. Before the 20th century, paleontologists tell us we lost about 4.5 million acres a year to catastrophic fire in California. But land management brought that down to about 250,000 acres a year, a fraction of what we had lost to nature because of good land management. But we passed laws then that made that management all but impossible. And we've watched the acres destroyed by catastrophic fire return to their pre-modern levels. In 2020, we lost about 4.3, I think, million acres to catastrophic fire in California. Now, is that nature or is that policy?
Well, I would refer to policy first, but when you recognize that most of those forests are growing from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4% a year, and you're compounding that growth every year for now 3 decades, you've increased your inventory of carbon in that forest horrendously from what it was naturally back 100 years ago. So you have, policy has caused a huge problem in building back to where we now have catastrophic fires due to the fuel load on all those forests.
Mr. Canterbury, we not only auctioned off excess timber to provide revenues for land management, we also did a great deal more ranching. You mentioned that sheep and cattle ranching that suppressed brush growth. Why aren't we doing that these days at the same levels we used to?
Thank you, Congressman. And so I think if we look back in history, significant reduction to the AUMs that is allowed today, what there was 30, 40, 50 years ago is very significant. So I would ask, we need good, nothing replaces good conservation and land management on the ground.
Right.
It can't be made back here. I'm sorry. We need to be able to dictate our own futures on the ground, working with our partners every day, whatever agency that may be.
Yeah, one of the other sad things, I toured the devastation of the Southern California fires a few weeks ago, and just noted that that's how nature gardens. She removes excess growth by disease, pestilence, drought, and ultimately catastrophic fire. And I recall the city of Altadena being absolutely destroyed by the fires. The Trump administration, in its first term, started the years-long process to get a permit to cut fire breaks to protect the town of Altadena from the surrounding national forests. Biden came in, reversed that, and then declared wilderness protection over those forests that make land management all but impossible. And the result was nature returned to do the gardening, and Altadena was destroyed in the process. It's sad. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Gentleman from California yields. And I'll recognize the gentleman, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses for being here, for traveling to Washington, D.C. In some cases, we appreciate your testimony. In particular, I want to thank my good friend and someone whom I think has been an exceptional public servant in the state of Colorado for many, many years, and that's Commissioner, State Representative, State Senator, and now, of course, Executive Director Gibbs. And couldn't agree more and concur with his assessments regarding what needs to be done with respect to a number of the issues that he described. And of course, I'm biased because he is my constituent back in Summit County, Colorado, but we're grateful for him being here. I want to just follow up, Mr. Canterbury, sorry, I hope I pronounced that right. Is that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay, great. I want to follow up on a particular provision of your written testimony. So I believe this is the second to last page. You write, as one of, it says, while the list is not exhaustive, I offer the following suggestions for immediate action. And one of those suggestions, you've underlined it, direct targeted resources to environmental analysis and permitting for rangeland monitoring and grazing allotments. What do you mean by targeted resources?
So, thank you, Ranking Member Neguse. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, what we're talking about there on those targeted funds, if you will. We need to very specifically target some funding. Every agency, as you know, is out of funds. We need some funding directly for the monitoring protocols.
That's right.
That we all live by.
Yep.
So that agencies can get this monitoring done.
So here's why I asked. No, you answered the question. Thank you, Mr. Canterbury. And because you've resolved that in my mind. I just want to make sure I understood that. When you said targeted resources, what you mean is targeted funding. That's the word you used. I concur with that assessment. Were you invited here by the majority or by the minority of this committee? As a witness today.
That's a really good question. I'm assuming I was in.
Why don't I answer that question for you? You were invited by the majority, and we're delighted to have you. In particular, as a Coloradan, I'm certainly delighted to have you here. But the reason why I say this is my colleague from California, took great umbrage with the idea that the Democratic witness and Democratic members of Congress are demanding more funding, and yet. Right here, one of your principal recommendations, and it's a common sense recommendation, by the way, is for more funding for this particular, the nature of the work that you've described. And it's not all that complicated, right? I mean, many of you have testified about multiple use, and some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, agree with your assessments regarding timber sales or energy leases. Who manages those? Who would you go about calling if you were going to try to procure a timber sale? How does that happen? Mr. Canterbury?
So, Ranking Member, thank you for that question. I don't deal in the timber industry, but I certainly deal in the livestock industry.
Sure.
And my cows eat the understory and
Yes,
keep
sir.
those succulent vegetating
But where would you go
plants.
about procuring a grazing lease? Who do you go to?
So
You go to the federal agencies, right? You go to the BLM.
I deal with my local agency folks. Yes,
Correct.
sir, I do.
Exactly, right? They're federal employees. These are individuals who work for the federal government, particularly the BLM, right? The same can be said for any number of the multiple uses that this committee is apparently endeavoring to discuss today. My broader point is that as we're discussing multiple use and the benefits of multiple use and the need for the federal government to be more responsive, a mile away, President Trump is endeavoring to gut every federal agency piece by piece. Mass rescission offers, buyouts, so-called buyout offers to the federal government, including some of the same BLM employees that you work with, sir, that every witness here works with. And it feels a little bit like we're in the twilight zone here. We're supposed to have sort of normal federal land subcommittee hearing to discuss the propriety or the benefits of multiple use and ignore the storm that is developing around us. I mean, I'm sure you all are aware of this. Agencies are being shut down here in Washington. CFPB effectively just a few days ago. I don't know if the BLM will be next. I suppose we're going to find out. So I would just encourage the chairman of this subcommittee, and I want to give him my sense. We certainly are not going to treat these hearings as business as usual until our colleagues on the other side of the aisle step up, tell the administration to pull back, and we can get back to regular order. Because there's a lot that these witnesses have proposed that is reasonable and common sense and bipartisan. But let me assure all of you, none of it will come to fruition if the current administration has its way. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know well, in northern Minnesota, we have the 3 T's, timber, taconite, and tourism. I'd argue there are a few communities across this great nation that understand and benefit from the multi-use mandate more than the communities across northern Minnesota that I am proud to represent. My district is home to 2 working industrial forests, including the Chippewa National Forest and the Superior National Forest, where we responsibly harvest timber and mine the taconite that is used in production of 80+% of this nation's domestically produced steel. And located on the Superior is the Duluth Complex, which is the largest untapped copper nickel find in the entire world. But we will only be able to responsibly mine these minerals needed to power our 21st century economy forward if we uphold and promote the multiple use mandate on our federal lands. Mr. Neiman, thank you for being here today. I want to share that I know your industry quite well, given the makeup of my district. It's home to dozens and dozens of timber harvesters, mills, and other wood product manufacturers. Unfortunately, we've seen several mills shut down in recent years, leading to the loss of hundreds of jobs. And in most cases, this has been due to regulatory burdens put in place by the EPA and other federally regulatory agencies, as well as the Forest Service failure to uphold their end of the bargain of the multiple use mandate and enable us to reach our timber harvesting goals. Can you talk about the economic impact of mill closures in rural communities where your companies operate?
I sure could. Thank you very much. And please say hi to Howard Hedstrom for me.
I know Howard very well.
A great friend. I'm going to talk first. I've lived through 6 recessions in my lifetime at my age, going clear back to the 70s. And our family's been able to weather those storms and get through them. This is the first recession in the timber business that we've been in that we've had to deal with no timber supply and running out of wood. You can figure out how to get through recessions sometimes and weather storms like we have in the past. You can't operate a sawmill without wood. Along with what you recognized, the high cost of added costs that's happened in inflation over the last 3 or 4 years, and all the regulation that comes on with that. That regulation has cost the government a whole lot more to put up that wood and made it less valuable to us at the same time with the added cost we have to go through. So I hope that answered your question.
It does, and there's a timber harvester that was reluctant to even go out and harvest the timber. He couldn't afford the fuel. Wasn't going to make it on just harvesting the timber. So, Mr. Neiman, one last question. Is it fair to say that if the Forest Service was doing a better job of meeting its timber harvesting goals, many of the jobs in the timber harvesting and forest products industries wouldn't be at risk, allowing for the maximum allowable sale to be harvested?
I don't know of any place in the country that's right now. If you know of any, I don't know of any forest meeting their ASQ.
Right.
I know of none.
That's the point of the question. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gibbs, is a forest fire subject to a NEPA analysis? That's not hard.
No.
Is a forest fire subject to PM/NAAQS regulations?
No.
What does a better job of sequestering carbon from our atmosphere? A manufactured wood product, an insect-infested tree, or a burnt forest?
You know,
That's not hard either. It's a manufactured wood product. Mr. Gibbs, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Huffman, for 5
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I always learn something in these. Mr. Stauber just, suggested maybe if we require NEPA for forest fires, we could solve this problem. I wish it was that simple. I also wish it was as simple as my colleague from California portrayed in his very nostalgic, gauzy view of the 1970s. I wish that all of the problems of rural economies and fire risk could be solved by just rewinding back to the 70s and doing everything the way we used to back then. But the truth is, not everything was perfectly done in the 1970s. In fact, some of the timber harvest that took place in the 70s and 80s was not sustainable. Some of these clear cuts created long-term damage, and we still have watersheds that are bombed out, fisheries that are devastated by erosion and other problems from some clear cutting that just shouldn't have happened, at least not in the way that it did. Not only driving some species to the brink of extinction, but devastating salmon in the western United States. And we've had to spend so much public dollars trying to restore a lot of the damage that was done then. And I look around my district, and some of the most unhealthy forests that we have were forests that were clear cut during that golden age and then replanted with, even age plantation forests that are totally unhealthy and very vulnerable to catastrophic fire. So we shouldn't be too nostalgic and gauzy about the 1970s. We're all trying to solve problems here, but I think we've got to do it with clear eyes. And so, Director Gibbs, I wanted to ask you just about what's happening right now with this federal funding freeze, because in my district, I just recently talked to the Humboldt County Resource Conservation District about how the freeze in federal funding and all of this chaos and uncertainty is causing their entire community wildfire defense program to just be frozen and suspended. And of course, they work with other partners, with tribes and local governments and private landowners. Often the federal funding leverages all of those other resources. It gets people working together in ways that they wouldn't otherwise collaborate. And we are now weeks into a freeze. We could be months in before it's over. We could lose the entire season. Tell me what's happening in Colorado, and what are your thoughts about the effects of these actions on the ground?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. It's, to say the least, it's created major uncertainty, to say the least, for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. We have more than 350 federal grants that support approximately $300 million worth of programs, with a staff capacity of 490 people that are funded through federal funding. We do extensive work at the Department of Natural Resources. Picture us like almost like a miniature Department of Interior. We handle land, water, wildlife, minerals, and oil and gas. And let me just give you a quick snapshot of some of these potential impacts. And we're really monitoring this closely because it's day by day. I actually have meetings initially when the executive orders came out where I had meetings first thing in the morning and then later on in the afternoon, because there was such uncertainty for me and my staff to understand what are we going to be reimbursed for, who's going to be our partner. Just a couple days ago, I actually, my staff asked us if I should fund a $4 million critical dam project that our Parks and Wildlife team manage. And this is considered a dam where if there was a breach or a earthen dam where there would be there could be huge consequences for a local community if not funded. We decided to fund that program moving forward without really knowing if we're going to be reimbursed. But everything from wildlife operations to outdoor recreation, aquatic nuisance species, as you know, out west, that's a huge challenge. Water Conservation Board, we have a water-ready watersheds program that works with local communities to do a threat analysis to understand if there is a major catastrophic wildfire, what that would mean to the local community, where those sediment issues would be, where the community would be most at risk. We also have a floodplain mapping unit that's funded through federal government. And then our Energy and Carbon Management Commission, we have our Orphan Well program. And then to this date, within our Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, a program for our abandoned mine program, which is funded through IIJA funds, are frozen right now. Yep. And this is looking at like critically life and safety of people in Colorado, where if our team can't get in there and do remediation work, it could have seismic, challenges for our communities. And so it's created uncertainty and huge challenges and confusions, to say the least, but we're monitoring it very closely.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Amadei from the great state of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. It's interesting to me to hear questions regarding public lands. Obviously, that's this subcommittee, and how things are going and uncertainty that's caused by things from members that have left. As a state that the federal government owns between 80 and 85% of, and if you don't think that's impact, and that's not, sir, you got my attention. We said, hey, 80% of my county, but I was busy feeling sorry for you because my colleague to my right said, that guy used to be my boss. I'm going, geez, I wonder how he's holding up. But anyhow, nonetheless, I want to just start with before all this uncertainty of 23, 24 days ago, and let's start with you, Mr. Gibbs. Can you tell me if the Forest Service before 24 days ago was fully staffed for all their positions in your state? timber people, watershed people, archaeological people, were they fully staffed federally in the state of Colorado? And when you tell me that, if you know, tell me about BLM. Were they 100% on range cons, 100% on realty executives, 100% on all that? And let me tell you why I'm asking you, so I'm not trying to trick you, but the reason I'm asking you is because if you want to talk about staffing and resources, it's like, even though there was a lot of money poured into the Department of Interior under the last administration, they weren't filling those jobs. They weren't paying those people a wage that they could live in your communities. And we'll go through Utah, and we'll go through, if you're answering for Colorado, we'll go through anybody else who wants to talk about. But it's like, my point here is, when was the last time that resources were fully funded in terms of personnel to manage those assets and those programs that you talked about, to your knowledge, in Colorado?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I don't know all those answers because, of course, I don't work for the BLM or U.S. Forest Service, but I will tell you, Congressman, that we do have a shared stewardship agreement with U.S. Forest Service. It's very robust.
Let me stop you there because my time's limited.
Okay.
So I'll take that as I don't know. Well, I do because I do oversight for those agencies. And if they are fully staffed in your state, then God bless you. Because you know what? The staffing levels in my state, where the land management mission is no more important than anywhere else, they control the whole state. 80+%. And you know what? They can't get people to apply even. And you know what? As a guy who works on the appropriations side, it's like, please pay your people a living wage so they can go work in Gunnison, or they can go work in Heber or wherever. And it's like, yeah, we're working on that. We're working on that. And I'll just say this, and I think I'm going to get the same thing, and so I'm not going to press this, but I'll just tell you this. You want to talk about resources for agencies that manage public resources, it goes back a long way before 23 days ago. And it's shameful. I've got this saying, it's like last time we had a resource administration, here's a bipartisan statement, ladies and gentlemen, was probably Teddy Roosevelt. And you know who knows that more than anybody else? I would submit Westerners know that. Your Western state, my Western state struggle to manage vast tracts of federal resources. And then we can argue about what the right management is. But how can you sit there and gripe about it when we're not funding basic resource decisions, even some of which I may disagree with? So I would just say, you know, it's interesting that we do this in the context of whatever. If you're really about the resources, you really ought to give your federal land managers and those agencies the ability to engage fully. And you may have an agreement with them. I mean, my state does too. But it's like when you talk about millions of acres, it's like, we'll do the best we can. But I'll tell you what, it's time to talk about who's responsible for vast tracts of land in all Western states and giving them the tools to do it, whether it's range cons, forest techs, everything from soup to nuts. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield the remainder of my time, if I could, to my colleague from Utah.
Okay, well, in the 30 seconds I have, I'm just going to do one thing that I think would be cool, but I don't want to spend my 5 minutes on it. Eric, the last time we had a witness here from Utah, he had his dad and his wife with him, and I said, bringing your families pretty Utah. But could we just have your family stand up for a second? Because everybody in here is related to Eric Clark. Come on, hurry. I've only got 13 seconds. So that might be the most Utah thing I've seen, that you have that many family members here to watch you testify. And with that, I will yield back the remainder of Mr. Amadei's time.
The gentleman yields, and we will allow no more outbursts like that from the chair here in the committee. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Dexter from Oregon. And by the way, welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and really appreciate this opportunity to serve. I did want to just briefly say that job security being eroded is probably not helping recruitment as we move forward, but that's a little bit of a side note. As a representative for the state of Oregon, where over 50% of our land is federally managed, I know firsthand the beauty, biodiversity, and critical resources public lands have to offer. So thank you all for your testimony today and for coming on behalf of these public lands. They're treasures. In my own district, I have the privilege of representing one of Oregon's natural treasures and is a critical resource as well, the Mount Hood National Forest. And the Mount Hood Wilderness is home to diversity and a vibrant ecosystem, and certainly provides drinking water to more than 1 million people in the Portland area. And it generates millions annually for the local economy as well by facilitating various recreational activities, which I know are also very popular in Colorado and Utah. A recent poll found that 85% of voters in the Western U.S. support efforts to protect more of our natural landscapes. So there's a balance to be struck between development and conservation, clearly. But what I'm hearing from my Republican colleagues seems to potentially ignore our community's desire to ensure our children have access to a clean and livable environment for years to come. And I say that knowing the concerns that we have for our investments in our agencies. So we've heard from, I'm going to pivot to tribal co-management now. We've heard from witnesses today that an important component of public lands management involves the input of local communities. And if we want to ensure public lands are managed for the greater good, we have to acknowledge that the ecological expertise of local indigenous communities are a key component of achieving this goal. So it's for this reason I'm interested in advancing efforts led by my predecessor, Mr. Blumenauer, to ensure the Warm Springs tribe in Oregon is made a true partner in the U.S. Forest Service's efforts to steward the public lands within and around Mount Hood. So, Mr. Gibbs, you noted in your testimony the importance of shared stewardship. What are the benefits of incorporating tribal voices into that stewardship of federal lands, and how might these co-management plans improve our conservation efforts?
Yeah. Thank you, Representative, for that question. In Colorado, we have a very strong working relationship with our two federally recognized tribes. It's Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute. And we do not have currently co-management agreements, but we do have very strong state to tribal relationships that we can explore, that in the future. We're currently working very closely on fire mitigation work, where we can, partner on reservation land, exploring, state funding that could be there. Our team is working monthly to work together to really find a sweet spot to make sure that their voices are heard. I brought in a assistant director on tribal affairs for the Department of Natural Resources, so we can look at all of our 8 divisions and really look for potential partnerships and collaborations moving forward.
Great, thank you. And it's clear that these indigenous communities have cared for these lands for life immemorial or time immemorial. So we must therefore do better to seek their partnership. So thank you for your leadership in that regard. In 2020, the Mount Hood Wilderness was ravaged by 2 wildfires, and crews are still working on reopening recreational areas. Mr. Gibbs, you are a certified wildland firefighter by training. In your experience as a firefighter and your capacity now as the head of Colorado Natural Resources, do you think that tribal co-stewardship has helped in efforts to curb wildfire with the efforts you've made?
Yeah, they have definitely helped for sure. And I was actually, it was a great honor to serve on the National Wildfire Commission, where we came up with 148 consensus-based recommendations. So whether you're a Republican or Democrat on this committee, I really urge you to take a hard look at those recommendations, and tribal voices were a strong voice on those recommendations. So most definitely, we look for partnerships.
Very good. So I'm going to conclude in my 28 seconds. It's vital that we work together to promote policies that strengthen our local economies without sacrificing our children's ability to grow up and have access to these clean, livable environments. And I look forward to working with the majority on these policies, and I believe our tribal communities will look forward to that as well. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for coming and sharing with us today. This is always educational for us, and forgive some of us who have competing committees. We bounce in and bounce out. So if I do hit a repeat, that's why. But thank you again for being here. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing. The multiple use issue is hugely important. As pointed out, the federal government's got about 640 million acres of land across the U.S., and about 33 million of those is in my home state of Idaho. And in Idaho, the Bureau of Land Management manages around 11 million acres for multiple use purposes, and the Forest Service is about 20.4 million acres, including significant portions of 3 national forests. But here's the rub. The deferred maintenance backlog just for the U.S. Forest Service, this is across the country, but a lot of that's in Idaho, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.7 billion with a B. For Interior, that number is somewhere around $32 billion. That's the deferred maintenance backlog. So whether you agree with the federal management and the process and all that or not, the bottom line is they're overwhelmed. There's just simply not the resources to do it. And the ramifications of BLM public lands rule in Idaho have been hugely substantial. Stretches of BLM managed rangeland critical for livestock grazing have been heavily affected. And our ranchers are now required to renew grazing permits under restricting conditions. That places additional burdens on their operations, threatening the economic viability of our communities. Additionally to that, for some time, our sawmills have been facing closures because the logging project permits have not been available. Not the timber's there, we got more than enough of that. We can't get the logging project permits from federal land, and it fails to meet our industry needs. Mr. Neiman, I did catch most of your opening statement, but you described some of this, maybe not in the same words, but how do you think that we best hold our federal agencies accountable? From your vantage point, how do we ensure that, that we can improve some of those access to some of the resources we've got?
One of the things I'd look really hard at, and thanks for a very important question, one of the solutions I would use would be good neighbor authority. I know in Idaho, because I know a bunch of the industry in Idaho, in Wyoming, in Colorado, that have strong ties through their state agencies, particularly state forest, to help out. So good neighbor can step in and know what's best on the ground in those states themselves. So I would love to see in this transition that we're going through right now that more authority is given to the states to step in and treat those lands, because they know what's best. They're the ones that have to deal with the fires and the insects. We are in the middle of a catastrophe right now nationwide in all the western states of overstocked lands of fuel loads on the forest, and it's almost needs to be acted as an emergency, and that means we need more timber sales. And we can't do that without the existing forest products industry. If they go away, you have less tools in the toolbox for the Forest Service to treat it. So we've got to have new thinking going on here.
So we had about, to your point, we had about 1 million acres go up, just under 1 million acres of wildfire this last year, just in Idaho in the last year. So that's to your point. And I'll just also say, because I'm going to run out of time for questions, I'll submit those in writing, but I want to give you a follow-up on the Good Neighbor Authority. We do use that heavily in Idaho. Last Congress, I launched that again to include counties and tribes to be authorized for that. And that got through the House, but not the Senate. So we're going to try that again. And I think we will get that done. So we're going to get that expanded. I've got just a little bit left here, so I'm going to jump to Mr. Canterbury. What steps do you believe that Congress should be taking to protect grazing rights? What's the best thing we can do for you?
Thank you, Congressman. And as stated in my testimony, I think you all have an obligation for oversight on our agency folks. Make certain that they're following through with the guidance that you have given them, and they're not leaving the reservation and going on their own.
Thank you for that. Point well taken. And I would add that there's some lawsuit issues we also have to deal with, but that's for another time of testimony because I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Idaho yields, and I'll recognize the gentle lady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member. Thank you for all of you for traveling out here today. I've enjoyed listening to you today. I'm Melanie Stansbury, and I'm deeply proud to represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, which is right in the heart of central New Mexico and includes 10 rural counties. And so I know very well all of the issues that you all are here to talk about today, and I really thank all 4 of our witnesses here today. And I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Clark. We have a broken bureaucracy. And there's certainly no easy solutions. And Mr. Neiman, we absolutely need to be supporting our local timber sawmills. They're a critical part of the West, and especially also of forest stewardship. And I think especially family-run businesses are particularly important. And I also agree, Mr. Canterbury, that grazing is an important part of the West and our food system, and also increasingly for forest management, having our livestock not only grazing to make food, but also helping with forest stewardship is also becoming an increasingly important tool. And Dr. Gibbs, I appreciate your testimony today, and I'm going to ask a question here in a moment. And I want to just say I'm excited to serve on this committee. My background is as a water resources professional. I rarely get to say that these days, but I work for 20 plus years in the field of water resources planning and drought management, and obviously the intersection with land stewardship. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to serve on this committee. But I am concerned about what we've seen over the last 3 weeks in terms of what the administration has been putting forward in terms of policies. We saw a whole slew of executive orders on the first day of this administration, essentially undoing much of what the previous administration had done to protect private and sensitive lands, especially lands that are important for conservation reasons, for climate resilience, for wildlife habitat, for endangered species. There were areas that were removed from drilling in the outer continental shelf because they were considered unsuitable for various reasons. Areas in Alaska that have been removed for decades that, executive orders rolled back the protections for. And just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a slew of executive orders at the Department of Interior that are targeting DEI programs, that are targeting energy and mining, the outer continental shelf in Alaska. And we're also hearing that the Department of the Interior is reviewing the protection for national monuments. And I think all of these actions by the administration need to be discussed, because when you take them in the entirety of what they add up to, it's not just the rollback of the work that the last administration did. It's really the opening of massive amounts of public lands, waters, and mineral resources across the West to multinational corporations. And for what purpose? In the case of New Mexico, they're talking about taking away protections for Chaco Canyon. This is one of the most sacred places on the face of the planet for our Pueblo and Dene people. And they want to actually open up the greater Chaco Canyon area for oil and gas drilling so that some oil and gas companies can make a few $1 million off of it and ruin it for all of eternity. They're talking about the same. They're talking about opening, a vast mining operation at Oak Flat in Arizona, which is the sacred site of the Apache people for thousands of years. There are reasons why we protected these places. It's not an ideological affinity for some, technical term around multiple use. It's because they're sacred, because they have cultural importance. And the funding freezes are going to have real impacts for our communities. All of you have talked about land and water impacts. And Dr. Gibbs, I know you've already answered this, but, taking away and freezing all of this funding, millions of dollars to states, tribes, and local governments that could help with land stewardship, what kind of impact is that going to have on our communities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It could have devastating impacts on, just let's think about wildfire issues. Devastating impacts on protecting life, property, and critical infrastructure. From your experience being a water leader, impacts just on wildfires alone, if we don't have the resources and staff capacity to get out there to do fire mitigation work, to put together fire breaks, to work with our local communities to make sure we're doing work at the right pace, right location, right scale, could have dramatic impacts, not only on people in my community, but I know you know Colorado River issues well too, of course, but could have devastating impacts on 40 million people that depend on Colorado River water, for example. And so the relationship we have with our federal partners, whether it's dealing with remediation of orphan wells or old abandoned mines, water quality and quantity, these are life and death issues for people. It's not just something that should be wrapped up into politics at all. This is something that, being the head of the Department of Natural Resources, I think of often. I stay up at night thinking about not if but when we have our next mega fire, and thinking about all the different partners that are involved with fighting that fire and so forth. Whether it's the BLM or the U.S. Forest Service, they're my brothers and sisters as we work to problem solve this. And so it is scary to think about what potential impacts we could have. And we're just really monitoring it closely because we're just not sure right now what's in versus out, what's considered Green New Deal or what's not, And for us, it's common sense partnership at the end of the day that we need.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I hope that these funding freezes, and obviously the courts are weighing in right now, but I think, as was noted, this is life or death, especially in our fire-prone communities. And I noted, Dr. Gibbs, you're also a firefighter. Thank you for your service. Thank you.
The gentlelady yield. Okay, the gentlelady yields. I now recognize Representative Malloy for 5 minutes.
Well, I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here. I know this is a big sacrifice, and it really is helpful for us. I have follow-up questions for Mr. Canterbury, Mr. Gibbs, and Mr. Neiman, but you can probably relax because I have my old boss up here, and I only have 5 minutes to ask him questions. So I probably won't get to any of you. I may have to ask follow-up questions. So for my colleagues, Eric Clark is a smart guy because he hired me right out of law school before he knew if I had passed the bar. But also, when I first interviewed, he hired somebody else, not me. He hired me the second time. So this is a really long revenge plan I'm working on here. Now I've got him where I can ask him questions. Mr. Clark, you talked about consistency in your testimony, and some of these are projects you and I worked on together where we're working with an agency and they make one decision, but it takes them years to make a decision. Then they roll back that decision and it takes them years to roll back the decision. Then they change it again and it takes them years, and you have to keep studying it. And I've sat here and listened to a lot of talk about funding being frozen and how that's going to impact agencies. I just wonder if you can give us a guess. How much money do you think it could have saved taxpayers in Washington County if the agencies targeted, like our friend Mr. Canterbury suggested, targeted resources on getting projects done instead of dragging their feet for years while taxpayers are paying for man-hours and also analysis?
Thanks, Congresswoman. I just have to warn everybody, you never know what someone you're going to hire is going to do to you after the fact. Easily, our county taxpayers are easily losing $2 to $5 million a year as we're trying to work through these broken processes on projects that we know need to happen, that everybody agrees will eventually happen, but we just can't get them there.
Yeah, and is it fair to say that on some of the projects we've worked on together, there may be one personality in an agency that for ideological reasons just disagrees with what the county's trying to do, and one person in an agency can drag their feet and slow a project down for years?
Yes.
Is that fair? Okay, so I've been in a lot of hearings. I've been doing policy for a long time, and I always hear from agencies, we're expected to do more with less. They want us to do more with less. We can't fill our positions. We don't have enough people. I'd like to see agencies do less with less. And thank you, Mr. Neiman, for reminding us that the Forest Service has a mission, and it's a very targeted mission. And what I see is them doing a lot of things that are not that mission, but they can't fill the positions that are focused on watersheds and production. And so, Eric, I just want to, would you unpack for us a little bit, either with the Northern Corridor or with the Habitat Conservation Plan, how many people at those agencies you have to work with to do something that everyone agrees is a good idea and is eventually going to happen?
Yeah, thank you for that question.
You're welcome.
So in those of us that are boots on the ground in these situations, we work every day with our federal partners. And they want to be our federal partners, right? These are people that are living in our communities, that are doing work that they love, that are trying to help stuff get better. And so when we put together a land use application, we go into them and we say, hey, we need a new road. How are we going to make this a win-win? Or we need a new water project. How do we do that? We're interacting with the whole team, and we're doing it regularly, consistently, and we're having some back and forth and working through our disagreements. And that could be a great process. It should be a great process. That's how land management should be, where the local people are coming in and talking to the federal people, and we're working through those. But then what happens is we'll get a local person to write something up on their desk, and then it goes to a desk in Salt Lake, and then it goes to a desk in Denver, and then it goes to a desk in Washington, D.C., and before it trickles back to Denver, to Salt Lake, to our desk, we've lost a year and a half, and it all changes in that time. And so then the boots on the ground, great federal employees that are just wanting to get stuff done are pulling their hair out because they're tired of us calling them and saying, why isn't anything happening? And then it gets back to them, and it's different than the good thing that they put together and proposed be done.
Thank you. That's the important thing I wanted to get out of this hearing, and I'm almost out of time, so I just want to put a fine point on this because we've had a lot of talk on both sides about federal funding and do we need more, do we need less, and I agree with our friend next to you that it needs to be targeted, it needs to be focused on the agency's mission. And we're Congress, we control the purse strings. So right now, we've got an administration that's trying to show where money's being spent well, where it's not being spent well, and just remind everyone to ignore the hysteria and focus on the balance of power. We have an oversight obligation, and we're doing it here. Thank you all for being part of it. And with that, I am out of time. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ms. Randall for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. It's a delight to be here in this subcommittee to have a good discussion about federal lands management. I have the great honor of representing Washington State's 6th District, which is most of the Olympic Peninsula and a little bit of the city of Tacoma. And in the peninsula, we are lucky to have the Olympic National Park. Park that spans 922,651 acres and includes 95% designated wilderness. And surrounding the park, we also have the Olympic National Forest, federal forest land. We are really lucky in Washington to have this unique ecosystem in our backyards, and many people who have lived there for generations and generations, including the usual and accustomed land of 12 federally recognized tribes who have stewarded it since time immemorial, and many folks who choose to move to the beautiful Pacific Northwest because of this unique place. I'll never forget one of my first canvassing experiences as a state Senate hopeful when I knocked on the door of a Republican woman who said, "Oh, don't waste your time with me. I'm not going to vote for you." And then I asked her what she cared about, and she said protecting the waters that are home to the orca whale in Washington State. And that really exemplifies to me how bipartisan the protection of our unique ecosystem is in Washington's 6th. One of the things that is special about this place is how many ways folks have to access the lands. Folks hike and camp. They hunt and fish, and science happens in the forests and in the waters, of the Hoh River and Lake Quinault, and in the national park and along the Pacific coast. It's also an incredible boon to our economy to attract folks out to visit this special place. Mr. Gibbs, the outdoor recreation economy in Washington State accounted for 639, not in Washington broadly, accounted for $639.5 billion in 2023 nationwide, We know that parks and public lands are centerpieces of this business, and that means jobs and opportunities for communities, especially communities like mine. Could you talk about the role you've seen public lands play in the outdoor recreation economy in Colorado and how selling off public lands to corporations or shutting down our access to recreation in order to create more resource extraction might impact it?
Thank you, Representative. And I was just thinking, what a beautiful location that you represent. I'd love to visit that area sometime. In Colorado, we're also really blessed with just amazing, beautiful outdoor spaces and vistas and rivers. We're also blessed with amazing outdoor recreation opportunities. I would argue that we have some of the best, or the best, places to go skiing and to hunt and fish, to go rafting with your friends and family and so forth. And outdoor recreation is $36.5 billion to our state's GDP. So it's significant. And, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I would argue anyone in back of me, I would ask them, what do you think of when you think of Colorado? Many people think of the world-class recreational opportunities. And I think it's really important to note that in Colorado, we work hard to find a balance. We can be the fourth largest oil and gas producing state, while at the same time having the best skiing opportunities, while we also have some of the best mountain biking opportunities, and working hard to find a balance. We also have what's called our outdoor regional partnerships. Mr. Canterbury and I really agree on, there's one particular location in his community called Envision Chaffee County, where we work hard to bring the ranching community together, along with the mountain bikers, along with the firefighters, and all different user groups, to try to find that sweet spot, because it's not them or oil and gas or recreation. It's recreation, and it's preservation, and it's conservation, and it's supporting our wildlife. So it's all the above approach that we work really hard in Colorado to strive for. Thanks.
Don't forget the timber.
And the timber industry plays an important role too.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Now recognize the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Mr. Kennedy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, and I'm honored to work with you as the Vice Chair. Thanks for that opportunity, and thanks to the witnesses, particularly Honorable Clark. Mr. Clark, thanks for being with us and tolerating your former employee's persecutorial questions that she has. I'm looking forward, actually, to working with all of you to make sure that we revitalize and restore multiple use of federal lands together. I think we can do that. The Biden administration has ignored Utah's needs and neglected their duties to keep federal lands open to the public. By limiting Utah's resources, the Biden administration artificially limits the state's economic growth and has limited the opportunity for housing and jobs for young Utah families. The youngest state in the union is Utah. And we're supportive of using these lands so that these young families can have an opportunity to grow. In addition, I refuse to allow the federal government to neglect Utah lands any longer, and I'm looking forward to working with the Trump administration to find solutions to bring much needed relief to struggling Utahns, particularly in our rural communities. And so, Mr. Clark, I had a question for you in that regard, because you know very well the Northern Corridor, and thanks for your written testimony. It details a lot of what's happened in the Northern Corridor in Washington County. It's been negotiated in good faith under Trump and mandated by Congress, and this happened despite the county's extreme efforts to secure additional protections from the Mojave Desert tortoise. And I'm committed to working with the Utah delegation and the Trump administration to construct the highway and boost Washington County's economy. How did the Biden administration's decision to refuse the Northern Corridor affect the locals, tourists, and the Mojave Desert tortoise is my first question.
I mean, the short end, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And I apologize if I slip and refer to you as Senator. That's because the last time we did this, you were in the State House or the State Senate. It harms all three. When we can't build infrastructure in a rapid growing area, that harms quality of life. It harms the ability for tourism to continue to flourish and the regular residents. But the fact that we went so far above and beyond, where the road had already been said, Congress had already said, you're going to get a road there, but we still mitigated for it under the Endangered Species Act in order to prevent a lawsuit. We went so far above and beyond and protected thousands of acres of desert tortoise habitat. Then to have that taken away just felt like a slap in the face to us.
In your testimony, your written testimony, even as to the tortoise, you mentioned that 8-to-1 or even 10-to-1 tortoises would suffer as a result of the Biden administration's decision. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yes, so tortoises are unique and endangered species in that they don't move fast. And so we can go out, we can put a road through tortoise habitat. We can clear the tortoises. We can put in tortoise culverts. They're burrowing animals. And so we can put a road through habitat with some impact, but really pretty minimal impact. And that's what we proposed to do, was put a road through an area, and then we offset that with 7,000 acres of protected area, half of which was developable. Now that developable 3,500 acres, if that gets bulldozed and houses go there, that's not the same thing as having culverts under a road. That's permanently taking away the habitat.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. I'll yield the rest of my time to my extremely outstanding colleague, Congresswoman Malloy, who's got some additional questions.
I'm abusing my authority like I always do in your subcommittee, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your patience with me. Mr. Clark, one more question is probably all I have time for. But one of the things I wanted to point out at the end of my time and ran out of time for is that in the case of the Northern Corridor or the Habitat Conservation Plan, who pays for your time?
My county taxpayers.
And who pays for the time of the people who work at the Habitat Conservation Plan?
Also county taxpayers. We have a big team, including biologists, that are all county employees.
And who pays for the time of the county commissioners who've been negotiating this?
Also county taxpayers.
And who's paying for the time of all the federal people who are dragging their feet and making it take longer?
And that is all of us as a country.
So we're talking about a road. We know how to design it. We know how to make it tortoise friendly, but we've got people who are applying for a permit, people who are slowing down the permit, and the taxpayers are paying all of them. So when we talk about how we could do less with less, this is what I'm talking about. We could design a road, make it environmentally friendly, and mitigate for any impact to tortoises in a small fraction of the time that it's taken and with a small fraction of the taxpayer dollars spent that it's taken. And so it's sort of a charade we're playing to pretend that all of these processes we're going through are doing anything good for tortoises or for the taxpayers. You've got 8 seconds if you want to respond to that.
I couldn't agree more. So much resources are wasted and so many good things are prevented from being put into place because we can't get projects done. And if I could make any ask, anything that Congress can do to help cut through that tape and not just impose time limits or reduce things, but actually reduce the bureaucracy so that we can get stuff done is gonna help those of us that have to get things done on the ground able to accomplish things.
Thank you. And thank you for yielding me your time. I appreciate it.
The Utah delegation yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming.
Thank you. Lest we forget, the 2001 Clinton roadless rule denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of Forest Service lands. It was the largest rulemaking in U.S. history at the time. And since then, we have watched as our forests have been decimated because of a lack of active management. Global warming and climate change are nothing but a scapegoat to cover up the true impact of the Democrats and radical enviros' failed land management policies. In fact, Colorado is ground zero for the beetle outbreak, which occurred because of the 1997 blowdown in the Route National Forest that took down 13,000 acres of trees in one night. That beetle outbreak then spread throughout the entire interior West, not because of global warming, not because of climate change, but because the Forest Service refused to allow treatment or harvesting in those 13,000 acres. And our Forest Service have been destroyed since that time. The Biden administration's restrictive federal land policies have significantly impacted the timber industry, particularly in Wyoming, where Neiman Enterprises is one of the largest sawmill operators. Forest management has led to worsening wildfire risks, as well as insect infestations, which threaten both timber supply and forest health. The U.S. Forest Service failed to meet its timber harvest targets by 260 million board feet in fiscal year 2024 and reduced targets for future years. Mr. Neiman, how has this affected sawmill infrastructure in timber-dependent communities in Wyoming?
I'll start and go back to, we originally had 3 sawmills in the Black Hills. We shut one down in Hill City, South Dakota, laid off 125 employees. 2 years ago, we laid off 1 shift at Hewlett. It went to, so from 2 shifts to 1 shift, laid off about 40 or 50 employees. Spearfish a year ago this spring, laid off 60, 70 employees at Spearfish, South Dakota. Along with that, we've laid off about 15 logging crews that spread throughout the hills from a lot of different communities throughout the area. So we've reduced our employment tremendously. When you go from 2 shifts cut in Ponderosa to 1 shift, your costs go up. And then you compound that with all the inflation costs that's happened in fuel costs, it puts you in a real precarious position. So we're hanging on by a thread with less than 1 year under contract right now, figuring out what is our next move. I hope we see some really significant changes that puts us back on track. So we hope that we can see the light of day here fairly soon so we can see some hope. And I'm a 3rd generation. I hope to pass it on to the 4th and maybe the 5th generation. If we don't see that light, then I'll be making more restrictions and shut down. And the impact that has on communities is tough.
These policies have horrific impacts upon forest health, upon our environment, upon our watersheds, but it also has horrific impacts on our communities, taking away our jobs. Since the year 2000, over 1,500 sawmills have shut down due to declining timber sales. What policies should Congress pursue to restore multiple-use timber harvesting and prevent further economic losses in Wyoming's forestry sector?
Well, I would start. We had Congressman Westerman in here a few minutes ago. I would start by passing the bill that he's proposed,
Healthy forests?
Yeah. I think that would be a good start, but there's going to need other actions along with his bill. And I know Senator Thune, Senator Barrasso are working on some amendments that should be helpful. But it's going to take a clear change of direction to get this shape back up.
You know, one of the things that bothers me so much about Washington, D.C., and Representative Malloy has touched on it a couple of times here, we're $36 trillion in debt in this country. And what that means is we've spent massive amounts of money with deficit spending. Deficit spending in and of itself is bad, but it also covers up a lot of really bad policies. It's wonderful to have flowery language about protecting recreation and the Belknap and the little, the flower here and I want to see a tortoise there. It's so fine and dandy to say all of that. But when you destroy your communities and destroy your tax base, you become incapable of actually protecting the very environment you profess to love. There has to be a balance in the way that we manage these resources. These catastrophic forest fires are spewing more carbon into the atmosphere than every single car in the entire country in a matter of months. What we saw in California is an absolute tragedy beyond anyone in this room's imagination, and it is because of failed land use policy and a refusal of people to recognize that global warming and climate change and screaming that at the top of your lungs isn't going to do a damn thing to fix any of this. It is imperative that we manage these resources for the best interests of the American citizens. I appreciate you being here and being willing to talk about common sense solutions and why we must change course if we are going to protect and preserve these resources into the long distant future. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I'm going to take my 5 minutes for questioning now. By the way, I think that's the Fix Our Forests Act that you might have been referring to, Mr. Neiman. Mr. Clark, you talked about it was either a community or your family's mill closed. Tell us a little bit about that mill closing and why it closed?
So it was a community mill in Escalante, and it closed around the 90s when you were talking about there was a lot of things that happened. And my personal experience, I spent a summer working for the Forest Service on a trail crew, and I remember having a conversation with the forester who was kind of over timber permits at that time. And I remember I definitely treated her like I assumed that she was, I'm definitely on the right side of the spectrum. I treated her like she was not on my side of the spectrum. And she stopped me one day, she said, look, I'm a forester. Like, I want to have healthy forests. You've got to understand that that's what I'm going for. And so she and I had a conversation about the forest. And what would happen is a Utah-based environmental group would file a lawsuit every time they issued a timber permit. And it made it impossible for a lawmill or a sawmill in a pretty remote area to have what they needed.
So as a result of those lawsuits, that was a big part of why that mill had to close?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there more mills in Utah today than there were 20 years ago?
Definitely not.
Significantly less?
Significantly less.
You said something about you would want to change something in regards to judicial review. What is that specific item? I think you said in your testimony. What is that item that you would like to see change?
So we were the victims of an out-of-court settlement where had the Biden administration just defended or stepped away and let us defend an action, we would have been fine. But the environmental groups filed a lawsuit challenging something that the Trump administration had approved, and then there was an out-of-court settlement that wasn't based on anything important. And so what we need is more certainty. The sue and settle thing harms us.
So it was a sue and settle?
Yes.
And it's been used time after time, hasn't it, to stop projects, to stop proper management in the western states in particular. Is that right?
And in particular, projects that have gone through the whole process and have been green-lighted finally, and then they get this sue and settle that isn't based in the facts. It's just based on the politics.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Canterbury. Earlier, you had a number of questions from Representative Neguse, and he tried to get this committee to believe that the first thing you believe in is that there needs to be an increase in funding. They call it resources here in Washington, D.C. There needs to be more resources. That's called greenbacks by most people. Is it necessary to increase the budget by the Bureau of Land Management to get more money to you, or could there be money that could simply be redirected and get it to the ground in order to be able to get the permits that you need?
So if I may, and I'll try not to take too much time, if we just back up in history, when I used to walk into the agency office, there would be 3 people in the office that managed the entirety of the resources and the lands that are being managed today with 300 to 400 people. Those 3 people could talk to us and sit down and figure out what was the best. We cannot regulate conservation. Conservation comes from those of us that's on the land.
Yeah. So, in other words, if the dollars are spent appropriately, you can get the permitting process can be completed for grazers like yourself. Is that correct?
It can be completed. You can help simplify that permitting process.
Mr. Neiman, if we change regulations, and would you rather have us change regulations and permitting, those type of things, or would you like the federal government to give you more money?
The first, for sure. Less regulation. I don't want more money. Businesses should stand on their own if it's given a fair chance. So regulation is helping destroy us.
How many families lost jobs as a result of the mill closures, that the reduction in some of your mills and the mill closures? How many families have lost jobs?
Directly related to us, along with the independent contractors, someplace between 150 and 200 families lost their jobs. If I go back to what happened in the 90s, I think it was like 26 or 30,000 jobs were lost. It was a huge amount.
26 or 30 to 30,000 jobs where?
That was throughout the West.
Throughout the West. And Are Americans more likely to buy a 2x4, or you name whatever wood product? Are they more likely to buy that from an American company these days than they were 40 years ago?
I am seeing a strong trend to lean back to support buying American. Buy from the U.S. I'm feeling that.
Compared to 40 years ago, when you look at today, with the mill closures that we've had across the United States, are you more likely to buy a 2x4 that's been made in the United States? You know, I listened to this from the ranking member when you talked about Humboldt County out in California, and that, boy, things are just going to fall apart as a result of that. Are you completely dependent on the federal government? Is that what's being said here? When you hear a statement like that, I don't think anyone should want to be put in that position. And this conjecture that we may not be able to complete projects, let's see if those projects actually do not happen, because I can tell you the Trump administration is going to make sure that money gets to those frontline communities rather than funding that 400 people that it now takes to get a grazing permit out. Let's do it in an effective, efficient manner that reflects the wants and needs of the American people. So with that, I conclude my questioning, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we will ask that the witnesses respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the subcommittee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, February 14th, 2025. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands stands adjourned.